Rafael Trujillo's. By the 1960s, Rafael Trujillo's dictatorship in the Dominican Republic faced increasing international isolation. The attempted assassination of Venezuelan President Romulo Betancourt in 1960, orchestrated by Trujillo's intelligence agency, sparked a wave of outrage in the international community. The Organization of American States, OAS, imposed sanctions, and the United States began to distance itself from the regime. On May 30th, 1961, Trujillo was ambushed on a coastal highway near Santo Domingo and assassinated. His car was attacked by a group of conspirators, including both military and civilian individuals. Some of the attackers were longtime supporters of the dictator who had defected to the opposition. The operation was successful, but the plotters failed to seize power. General René Roman, who was expected to support the coup, hesitated and took no action. In the following days, Ramfis Trujillo, the dictator's son, returned from Paris and, with the support of the secret police, CM, took control of the situation. The regime launched brutal repressions. Dozens of people were arrested, tortured, or killed. 6 of the assassins were executed in what became known as the Hacienda Maria massacre. Despite this, by the end of 1961, Ramfis Trujillo left the country, taking his father's remains to Spain. Trujillo's assassination had far-reaching consequences. The CIA had provided weapons to the conspirators. Later declassified documents showed that American officials had discussed the possibility of supporting the rebels. While some sources claimed a minor role for the CIA in the assassination, further investigations revealed a deeper involvement of the United States, including ties to the conspirator groups and attempts to influence the transition period after Trujillo's death. Ayatollah Khomeini. By the late 1980s, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had ruled Iran as its supreme leader for a decade. During this period, he transformed the nation into a theocratic state, suppressed dissent, fought a devastating 8-year war with Iraq, and issued one of modern history's most notorious fatwas, the call for the assassination of author Salman Rushdie. However, by 1989, Khomeini's health was failing. He suffered from heart problems and had been hospitalized multiple times. In May 1989, his condition deteriorated significantly. He experienced 5 heart attacks over the course of 10 days. He was admitted to the hospital, and after 11 days of treatment, it became clear that even with the best medical care, his condition was irreversible. On June 3, 1989, at the age of 86, Ayatollah Khomeini passed away. In the aftermath of his death, a remarkable event unfolded. Millions of Iranians took to the streets to mourn him. The state declared a period of national mourning, and massive crowds gathered across Tehran and other cities. The summer temperatures were extreme, and to prevent the crowd from collapsing due to the heat, fire trucks sprayed water into the streets. Despite these efforts, the crowds were so dense that at least 10 people were trampled to death, and over 400 others were severely injured during the funeral. As the helicopter carrying his coffin landed at the cemetery, the crowd lost control. People surged past security barriers, and some rushed the coffin, pulling it from the helicopter and parading it around. In the ensuing chaos, the body itself fell out of the coffin. Khomeini's son Ahmad was even knocked to the ground as mourners attempted to get close enough to touch the shroud. The situation escalated to the point where soldiers had to fire warning shots to disperse the crowd and reclaim the body. Ultimately, authorities aborted the initial burial and removed the body to reorganize. Later that evening, a second funeral was held, this time with heightened security and a steel coffin to prevent any further issues. Slobodan Milošević. After years at the center of the violent conflicts in the Balkans, Slobodan Milošević found himself in a prison cell at The Hague. In 1999, during the Kosovo War, he became the first sitting head of state to be indicted for crimes against humanity by the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY. By the time his trial commenced in 2002, the list of accusations was extensive, including war crimes committed across Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. Milošević refused legal representation and chose to defend himself. The prosecution spent 2 years presenting evidence. The trial proved more challenging and protracted than initially anticipated. However, in March 2006, before the trial could reach its conclusion, Milošević was discovered dead in his cell in The Hague. An autopsy confirmed that he had died of a heart attack. He had a long history of heart problems and high blood pressure. Shortly before his death, the ICTY had denied his request to receive treatment at a cardiology clinic in Russia. His death sparked controversy. Some argued that the tribunal had been negligent in denying him outside medical care, while others suspected he might have deliberately contributed to his own demise through the misuse of medication. Regardless, he died before any verdict could be delivered. However, subsequent rulings from the tribunal concluded that Milošević was part of a joint criminal enterprise that employed violence and forced displacement to attempt to remove certain ethnic groups, such as Croats, Bosniaks, and Kosovo Albanians. Idi Amin. Idi Amin, considered one of the most brutal dictators in modern history, was ousted from power in Uganda in April 1979. As Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles advanced on the Ugandan capital, Amin fled by helicopter. He initially sought refuge in Libya before being granted asylum in Saudi Arabia by the royal family. A condition of his asylum was that he remain uninvolved in politics. However, even in exile, Amin remained a controversial figure. In 1989, he attempted to secretly return to Africa using a forged passport with the intention of raising a rebel army to regain control of Uganda, which was then embroiled in another civil war. However, he was quickly identified and arrested in Congo. After being transferred between several countries, he was eventually permitted to return to Saudi Arabia, but only after pledging to refrain from any further political activity. Following this, Amin chose to maintain a low profile, living relatively quietly with a portion of his large family. On July 19, 2003, one of his wives announced that he was in a coma and near death due to kidney failure. She appealed to the Ugandan president to allow him to return to Uganda to die, but this request was denied. Idi Amin died on August 16, 2003, in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, after his family made the decision to remove him from life support. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Ruhollah Cemetery in Jeddah without any official ceremony or fanfare. Ferdinand Marcos. In late 1985, facing growing discontent and increasing pressure from foreign allies, Ferdinand Marcos called for a snap election in an attempt to maintain his grip on power in the Philippines. The government declared Marcos the winner, but widespread allegations of electoral fraud and violence led many to believe the election was rigged. Reports of cheating and violence fueled mass protests and a military-backed uprising, which became known as the People Power Revolution. On February 25, 1986, Marcos held his own inauguration ceremony, but as the protests intensified and key military figures defected, he was forced to flee the country. With the assistance of the United States, Marcos, his family, and close allies were flown to Hawaii. While living in exile in Hawaii, Marcos resided in a large house and continued to live in relative comfort, even as hundreds of lawsuits were filed against him in the U.S., alleging corruption and the theft of funds from the Philippines. It was later revealed that Marcos had attempted to orchestrate a return to power, even discussing a plan to kidnap his primary political rival, Aquino. However, the U.S. authorities intervened and prevented him from doing so. Marcos contracted pneumonia in early 1989 and died on September the 28th of that year. Prior to his death, he expressed a willingness to return a significant portion of his wealth in exchange for being buried in the Philippines. However, the Philippine government refused his request, and his body remained in Honolulu. In 1993, his remains were eventually returned to the Philippines and placed in a refrigerated crypt in Ilocos Norte, where they remained for over 2 decades. In 2016, under the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, his remains were controversially reinterred at the Heroes Cemetery with military honors, sparking protests from groups opposing his authoritarian regime. Ante Pavelić. Following World War II, Ante Pavelić, the fascist dictator of the Nazi-aligned puppet state known as the Independent State of Croatia, went into hiding. His regime had collapsed alongside the Axis powers, and Yugoslavia sought his extradition for war crimes. Pavelić, however, managed to evade capture, at least for a time. His post-war journey was complex and circuitous. He disguised himself as a Catholic priest, traveled using a Peruvian passport, and found refuge in Vatican properties in Rome under assumed identities such as Don Pedro Goner. With assistance from contacts like Father Krunoslav Draganović, Pavelić successfully remained hidden in Italy until 1948, when he ultimately fled across the Atlantic to Argentina under another alias, Pablo Aranjos. In Argentina, he eventually secured a position as a security advisor to President Juan Perón, and even established a construction company, leveraging political connections. Despite his past, Pavelić lived relatively relatively openly and began to rebuild a political movement among Croatian exiles, seeking to revive the concept of a fascist Croatian state. However, his past had not been forgotten. On April 10th, 1957, the anniversary of the founding of his fascist state, a man named Blagoje Jovović, a former Royal Yugoslav officer and Serbian nationalist, ambushed Pavelić outside a bus in the Buenos Aires suburb of El Palomar. Jovović shot him twice, striking him in the back and collarbone. One of the bullets lodged dangerously close to Pavelić's spine. Although Pavelić survived the assassination attempt, it marked the beginning of the end for him. His identity was exposed at the hospital, and with the fall of Perón's government, the Argentine authorities became far more receptive to Yugoslavia's extradition request. Realizing his time was running out, Pavelić discharged himself from the hospital, still carrying a bullet in his body, and fled to Chile, then to Spain. From there, he continued to lead the Croatian liberation movement from the shadows, issuing messages urging Croats to re-establish an independent Croatian state. However, his health was failing. The wounds sustained in the 1957 assassination attempt never fully healed, and by late 1959, his condition had significantly deteriorated. On December 28, 1959, Ante Pavelić died in Madrid at the Hospital Alemán, officially from complications related to the bullet wounds he had carried for over 2 years. He was 70 years old.
I don't think you'll be able to click on the next video until time runs out. 3, 2, 1, you're lost.